My name is Captain Morgan Hayes, United States Marine Corps, deployed under NATO command along the Polish border during the winter that nearly broke us. If you've never stood in 18 degrees Fahrenheit wind while trying to keep a convoy moving through sleet and black ice, you can't quite imagine what cold discipline feels like. It burns. It numbs. It tests the line between duty and compassion. That morning, I thought I was following orders. By nightfall, I'd realize I'd risked my career for a single act of decency. We were on the last leg of a 70-mile humanitarian escort trucks loaded with blankets, medicine, and canned food for refugee camps outside Krakow. The roads were a mess of snow and mud. My Marines were exhausted faces, red raw from windburn hands blistered inside frozen gloves. Command had radioed us twice, no stops. Keep the convoy moving. Bandit activity was still a concern, desperate people, desperate times. But then I saw them. A woman and a child, maybe 6 years old, standing off the shoulder near a broken fence line. The boy's coat looked 2 sizes too big. The woman's scarf was frozen stiff. They weren't waving, not shouting, just standing still like they'd already accepted whatever was coming. My driver, Corporal Jenkins, muttered, "Ma'am, we can't stop." I said nothing for a long moment. The radio crackled again, another warning about fuel limits and daylight. I knew the rule: you don't break convoy for civilians. Every minute counts. But the image of that child, something about his eyes wide and glassy like he wasn't expecting anyone to help. I tapped the side of my helmet mic. "Pull over." Jenkins looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Captain with respect. "Pull over." We slowed to a crawl. The tires bit into ice. I stepped out, boots crunching in the snow. The air hit like broken glass against my face. I walked toward them, holding one of my ration packs, my last one. The woman tried to speak, but her lips barely moved. English wasn't her language. Hunger and cold had taken her voice. She just pointed to the boy, then to her stomach. I didn't think. I just tore open the pouch and handed it over. "Eat this," I said softly, slowly. The boy blinked unsure until his mother nodded. He started eating with tiny, trembling hands. Behind me, Jenkins hissed, "Captain, we're sitting ducks out here." "I know," I said. "Just another minute." The woman reached for my hand. Her skin was like ice shaking, but her grip was steady. She didn't say a word, just looked at me and gave a small nod. I'll never forget that look. It wasn't gratitude. It was something deeper. Recognition, maybe. A human acknowledgement in a place that had forgotten warmth. I slipped my glove back on and stepped away. "Stay close to the tree line," I told her, knowing she couldn't understand but hoping she felt the tone. Then I waved Jenkins forward. The Humvee groaned back to life, and the snow swallowed their figures as we moved on. Back at camp that night, the others joked about how I'd finally gone soft. Jenkins filed his report without mentioning the stop, but word travels fast in a tight unit. My lieutenant pulled me aside. "Captain, you know the standing order. You want to get chewed out by command for playing Florence Nightingale?" I shrugged. "If they ask, I'll take it." He shook his head. "You're one of the good ones, Hayes. Don't let that get you killed." That night I couldn't sleep. The wind clawed at the tent like something alive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that boy's face and the woman's silent nod. I told myself I'd done the right thing, but in the Corps, right is a slippery word. 2 days later, a new order came through. Command was investigating breaches of convoy protocol. Someone had reported an unscheduled stop. My name was on the list. I expected a reprimand, maybe a demotion. I rehearsed my apology, decided I'd say it straight, "Sir. I couldn't leave a child to freeze. Marines live by honor, after all." But when Major General Whitman's adjutant came to my tent, he didn't mention punishment. "The general wants to see you in person," he said. "Tomorrow, 0800. I felt my stomach tighten. Generals didn't waste time on captains unless something serious or strange was about to happen. That night, I ironed my uniform until the seams could cut paper. I polished my boots, checked my ribbons, ran through every possible scenario. Maybe I was being reassigned. Maybe they wanted to make an example out of me. As dawn broke, I looked out over the convoy yard, rows of trucks, frost-covered tarps, men and women moving like ghosts through steam. The cold didn't sting anymore. It just settled deep in the bones. I thought about that woman and child somewhere out there, maybe alive because I'd broken the rule book. I whispered a quiet prayer I hadn't said in years. Lord, let that small act mean something. When I reported to headquarters, the guard at the door saluted stiffly. Captain Hayes, General Whitman's expecting you. I stepped inside, heart thudding like rifle fire in my chest. The headquarters building was an old Polish administrative block that NATO had converted into command offices. The radiators clanked like they were coughing up ghosts, and the hallway smelled faintly of diesel and burnt coffee. Every bootstep echoed too loud, and I felt like the sound alone could reveal everything I'd done. Major General Whitman's aide, a thin lieutenant in spotless utilities, led me down the corridor. "You're early, Captain," he said quietly. "The General appreciates punctuality." I tried to smile, but my jaw felt locked. "Yes, Lieutenant." He paused outside a steel door, tapped twice, then opened it. "Captain Morgan Hayes, sir." "Send her in." The voice that answered was steady, calm, and far too composed. I stepped into the office, saluted sharply. The room was warmer than outside, but my hands still shook behind my back. Whitman stood behind a simple wooden desk, no medals on display, no family pictures. Just maps, dispatches, and the faint hum of a space heater. He was tall, mid-50s, the kind of man whose presence filled a room even when he said nothing. "At ease, Captain," he said. "Please sit." I sat. My pulse felt like a drumline under my collar. The General looked at a folder on his desk. "Convoy 17, 2 weeks ago, route Delta Kilo. You stopped for civilians." "Yes, sir." "You're aware that's a direct violation of NATO convoy protocol?" "Yes, sir." He studied me, not angry, just searching. "Why?" There it was. The question I'd been replaying in my head since that night. I could have given the safe answer: miscommunication, bad visibility, some convenient excuse. But I didn't. "Because, sir," I said slowly, "there was a woman and a child. They were freezing. I had 1 pack left. I gave it to them." He didn't blink. "You jeopardized the convoy for a pack of rations." "I jeopardized nothing, sir. We stopped for less than a minute. My team was alert. No harm came to anyone." Whitman leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands. "Captain Hayes, you're a good officer. Your record shows discipline, consistency, and good judgment. But in uniform, compassion can get people killed." I looked him straight in the eye. "Understood, sir. But I joined to serve, not to turn my back on people dying in the snow." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the hallway, a typewriter clicked like a ticking clock. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled barely. "You sound like I did 20 years ago." That startled me. "Sir." "Afghanistan," he said. "Winter of '09. My team leader gave his gloves to a local boy after a sandstorm. Lost 2 fingers to frostbite that night. He never complained. Said it was worth it." I didn't know what to say. Whitman closed the folder. "You won't be punished, Captain, but be careful what you think heroism looks like. Out here it rarely looks clean." "Yes, sir." He nodded toward the door. "You're dismissed." I stood, saluted, turned to leave. Before I reached the door, he said quietly, "One more thing. Where exactly did you stop?" "Near the east fence line, 2 kilometers past checkpoint Charlie, sir." He wrote that down, still not looking at me. "Thank you." I left the office feeling lighter but also uneasy. Why note the exact spot? Maybe he was just verifying reports, but something in his tone, measured, deliberate, told me it wasn't over. Outside, Jenkins was waiting near the trucks, puffing into his gloves. "So did he tear you a new one?" "Not exactly," I said. "He asked about the location." Jenkins frowned. "That's weird." "Yeah." The rest of that day dragged. The snow had eased, but the cold hadn't. I threw myself into logistics work, fuel reports, ration counts, maintenance logs, anything to keep from thinking. Still, every time I glanced toward the tree line beyond the base, I saw a flash of that woman's scarf in my mind. That night, I sat outside the barracks under a dull orange light, drinking instant coffee that tasted like rust. Sergeant Phelps joined me, lighting a cigarette. "Heard the General called you in," he said. "Yeah." "Bad?" "No, just strange." Phelps exhaled smoke. "You did right, Captain. Some of us forget what that means." I looked at the stars, faint through the haze. "Maybe. But command doesn't always agree." He smirked. "Command's just people with bigger desks. Doesn't make them right." We sat there a while, not talking. The cold gnawed through my uniform. Somewhere in the dark, a generator kicked on. 2 days later, an email came through NATO command announces arrival of distinguished guests. Security to be heightened. All officers on standby. I thought nothing of it. Diplomats came and went all the time. But when my name appeared again on the morning roster with a note report to command HQ 0900, I felt that same weight settle in my gut. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked as I tightened my collar. "No idea," I said. "Maybe they finally decided what to do with me." He grinned. "If they're giving out medals for feeding civilians, maybe I should have stopped too." Don't jinx it. When I walked back into headquarters that morning, the same lieutenant greeted me. "General Whitman's expecting you, Captain." And he hesitated. "We have visitors today." Visitors. He just nodded toward the door. "You'll see." Inside voices murmured. A child laughed high and soft, so out of place it made my heart stutter. I froze in the hallway, hand on the doorframe. That sound didn't belong here. Not in a command post built on steel and silence. "Captain Hayes," the general's voice called from inside, calm and measured. "Come in." I stepped inside the office, and for a second I didn't recognize the space. The maps were gone from the wall, replaced by a single blue NATO banner. A coffee pot steamed gently on the side table. And standing beside Major General Whitman was a woman with a scarf around her neck and a small boy clinging to her coat. The world seemed to narrow to a pinpoint. My vision tunneled. That scarf, those eyes, that child. My mouth went dry. I barely managed a salute. "Captain Morgan Hayes reporting as ordered, sir." The general's voice was steady. "At ease, Captain." He turned to the woman, his tone softening in a way I hadn't heard before. "My dear, this is the officer I told you about." She smiled at me faintly, nervously, and then said something in Polish. The boy peeked from behind her and waved. I stood frozen, unsure if this was a dream or some strange trap. My thoughts tripped over themselves. How could she be here? Why with him was I in trouble? The general looked between us. "Captain, I owe you an explanation." He gestured toward the chairs. I sat down carefully, every muscle tight. "My wife," he began, "is part of a NATO humanitarian team based near our convoy routes. 2 weeks ago, she and her escort vehicle were separated in the storm. Communications went down. We assumed the worst." He paused. His voice caught slightly before he continued. "They were stranded for nearly 36 hours in that cold." My breath caught. She told me someone stopped a Marine, gave her and my son food when everyone else drove by. I looked at the woman again. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "You," she whispered in a heavy accent, "you give food. For my boy." I swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am, I didn't know who you were." The general's lips twitched, half smile, half disbelief. "That's what makes it matter, Captain." He reached for his wife's hand. "She didn't tell me right away. She wanted to find you herself to thank you. I told her Marines don't do this for gratitude." I didn't know what to say. My hands were trembling in my lap. "Sir, I managed. I was just doing what anyone." He interrupted gently. "No, Captain. You did what most wouldn't. And I've been asking myself what that says about the rest of us." The room went silent. The sound of the boy's small boots scuffing the floor filled the space. He stepped forward and handed me something, a small wrinkled chocolate wrapper. "He keep it," the woman said softly. "From that day, he say, soldier gave him hope. That did it." My throat closed. I took the wrapper carefully like it was a medal. The general cleared his throat, trying to reassemble his command composure. "Captain Hayes, you didn't just feed my family. You reminded me that regulations mean nothing without humanity behind them. We lead better when we remember why we lead." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Thank you, sir. I only did what felt right." He smiled slightly. That's the kind of instinct this corps can't train but desperately needs. Then his tone shifted, quiet, thoughtful. "You risked reprimand for compassion. That's rare. I've been buried in rules long enough to forget what it looks like." The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered something. She nodded and they both stepped back. The general stood and straightened his uniform. "Captain Hayes, I want to offer you something. No, not a medal." He gestured toward the door. "Walk with me." We moved down the corridor. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel from the nearby runway. He spoke as we walked, his voice low. When I was your age, I thought leadership meant never showing weakness. That compassion made you soft. Then my wife went missing and I realized it's the only thing that matters. He stopped near a window overlooking the motor pool. Those trucks, those men out there, they'll forget half of what we order them to do. But they'll remember every act of decency they see from a superior. I nodded. Yes, sir. He turned to me. I won't forget this, Captain. Not because you saved my family, but because you reminded me what the word Marine still stands for. I didn't trust my voice enough to respond. I just saluted. He returned it crisp and silent. When I walked out of headquarters, the cold bit at my cheeks, but it didn't feel cruel anymore. Jenkins was leaning against the Humvee, chewing on a piece of gum. Well, he asked. I exhaled slowly. Let's just say, compassion's not off the record anymore. He grinned. So I shouldn't tell anyone you got promoted to saint. Not yet. We laughed, but my chest felt tight with something deeper than relief. It was gratitude, maybe. Or humility. The kind of feeling you don't talk about in the Corps because words can't carry it. That night I lay in my cot staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the hum of the heaters. For the first time in weeks I slept without dreaming of snow or guilt. When I woke before dawn, there was frost on the edges of my blanket and sunlight creeping through the canvas. I found the small chocolate wrapper still in my pocket. I pressed it flat and tucked it inside my journal. I didn't know it yet, but that little piece of foil would mean more to me than any decoration the Corps could ever give. 2 weeks passed before I saw Major General Whitman again. The mission tempo picked up and our convoy schedules doubled. The snow had softened into a constant drizzle, muddy gray, endless. I thought the incident was behind us. Maybe the general had said his piece and we'd all move on. Then the orders came through: all senior officers report to main hangar for formal briefing. Dress uniforms required. Dress blues in that weather felt cruel, but orders were orders. The air smelled like wet metal as I buttoned my coat, polished my shoes, and fixed my ribbons. The mirror in the barracks washroom showed a face that looked older than a month ago. The eyes didn't flinch anymore. Maybe they'd learned to expect surprise. The hangar was cleared out, the floor swept clean. Rows of chairs faced a makeshift stage draped with NATO flags. I took a seat near the back with the other captains. Jenkins shot me a quick look, half teasing, half proud. The general entered to polite applause. He wasn't a man who enjoyed ceremony, but that morning he carried a certain calm, a warmth I hadn't seen before. Beside him stood the same woman from that frozen road. She wore a neat gray coat, her hair pinned back, the faintest smile on her lips. Her son, now in a clean wool sweater, sat quietly on a chair near the podium. I felt the air thin in my lungs. Whitman began speaking. 2 weeks ago, during a severe storm, a NATO convoy under my command faced impossible conditions. One of our officers made a decision, one that broke regulation, but preserved something more important: humanity. I shifted uncomfortably. The captains glanced around. Nobody said my name, but I knew where this was going. "Captain Hayes," he said suddenly, front and center. Every head turned. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else as I rose and marched forward. The general motioned for me to stand beside him. This officer, he continued, reminded me and all of us that compassion is not weakness. It is strength in its purest form. He turned to the woman beside him. "Captain Hayes, I believe you already know my wife." The room froze, and for a heartbeat nobody breathed. The woman smiled softly. "We meet," before she said in accented English. "Snow, cold, you give food." My throat closed up. "Yes, ma'am, I remember." Whitman looked at me with quiet pride. "You didn't know who she was when you helped her. That's what makes this worth more than any commendation." He gestured to an aide who stepped forward with a small case. Inside was a silver medal, not for valor, not for combat, but for humanitarian service. He pinned it above my left breast pocket himself. As he stepped back, he said in a low voice, only I could hear, "You saved my family, Captain. But you also saved a part of me I'd forgotten." I tried to answer, but my voice caught. All I managed was, "Thank you, sir." He smiled just a trace. "Meet my wife." The crowd chuckled softly, not out of humor, but out of release. The tension dissolved like frost in sunlight. His wife stepped forward, shook my hand, and said, "You remind me why good people wear that uniform." I don't remember the rest of the ceremony clearly. Applause blurred into the hum of the heaters. Faces blended. But I do remember her boy how he stood straight-backed, hand over his heart as the anthem played. Later, as people mingled, the general caught up to me near the coffee table. "Captain," he said quietly, "you ever wonder what you'll remember about all this 10 years from now?" I thought for a moment, probably the cold. He chuckled. "You'll remember more than that? You'll remember the look on someone's face when you gave them hope." He turned away before I could reply, joining his wife and son. Watching them together, the way his hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder, I realized that my small act had rippled outward in ways I'd never grasp. Jenkins appeared at my side, holding 2 paper cups. "You just got pinned by a major general. Feel taller yet." "Maybe a little," I said. He grinned. "Well, ma'am, next time you break the rules, remind me to be standing nearby. Might rub off on me." I laughed softly. "Don't count on it." Outside, the drizzle had turned back to light snowflakes drifting lazily across the tarmac. I stepped into it, letting the cold sting my cheeks. Somewhere in the distance, a transport engine hummed to life. The metal felt heavy on my chest, not from its weight, but from what it meant. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the reminder that in a world trained for conflict, kindness still had a place. I looked down at my gloved hands, remembering that frozen moment on the road, the silent handshake that had changed everything. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Poland, I smiled without hesitation. After the ceremony, things returned to their routine rhythm: convoys, reports, frozen mornings, coffee that tasted like radiator water. But nothing really felt the same. Word of the medal spread quickly, and with it came quiet nods in the mess hall, small smiles from people I barely knew. Marines didn't gush about feelings, but you could feel respect shift like a current. Still, a strange restlessness stayed with me. When I lay in my cot at night, I kept thinking about the general's words, how kindness had reminded him what leadership meant. It was humbling, but also uncomfortable. I hadn't done anything grand. I'd just stopped. Why did that simple decision feel heavier than combat missions I'd survived? Maybe because it forced me to look at myself, not the rank, not the ribbons, but the person underneath the uniform. One evening I was walking back from the motor pool when I heard a voice behind me. "Captain Hayes." It was the general's wife, Anna. She stood by a jeep, her coat buttoned to her chin. The air smelled like snow again. "Ma'am," I said, saluting out of instinct. She laughed softly. "Please, no salute. I am not officer." "Habit, ma'am." She smiled and gestured for me to walk with her. "I want to say thank you again properly." "You don't have to, ma'am. I just did what anyone should have." She shook her head. "No. Many saw us. No one stopped. You did. You risk rule for stranger. My son, he talk about you every day. He tell people, the Marine who shared her food." I didn't know how to respond. Compliments were harder to handle than orders. "I'm glad you're both safe," I managed. She nodded slowly. "When my husband told me who you were, I cry. Not because he is powerful, man, because I see what good power can do when it meets good heart." Her words hit deeper than she knew. We walked in silence for a bit, boots crunching in the snow. She stopped at the edge of the compound fence and turned to me. "In war, sometimes people forget to be human. You did not forget." She offered her hand again. That same quiet handshake, only this time it wasn't desperate or cold. It was warm, alive. When she left, I stood there for a long moment, watching her walk toward the lights of the command tent. For the first time, I realized I didn't feel guilty anymore. I felt centered. The next morning, General Whitman called me into his office again. "Captain Hayes," he said, gesturing toward a chair, "I've been reviewing your field reports. You've shown exceptional judgment under stress." "Thank you, sir." He studied me for a moment. "I'd like you to take over logistics coordination for the next NATO relief column. It's a leadership role, more responsibility, less sleep." I blinked. "Sir, are you sure?" He smiled faintly. "You've proven you can balance heart and discipline. That's rarer than you think." I accepted the assignment even though I knew it would mean longer hours and colder nights. Something in me wanted to prove worthy of that trust. Later that week, while reorganizing supply manifests, I found an old field letter in my gear, a half-written note to my father that I'd started months ago and never finished. Dad had served 30 years as a Marine before retiring. We hadn't spoken much lately. He'd always believed emotion was a liability. Lead with your head, not your heart, he used to say. Heart gets you hurt. I looked at the blank page, thought of that woman and her son, and began to write. Dad, you once told me mercy has no place in command. I thought you were right until Poland. I learned that leadership isn't about power, it's about remembering people. Maybe I finally understand what you meant about honor. It's not the medals. It's what you do when no one will ever know. I signed it, sealed it, and slipped it into the outgoing mail pouch. Days later, as we prepped for another mission, I noticed the general watching the troops load trucks. His son stood beside him, small hands stuffed in his coat pockets. Whitman caught my eye and gave a small nod. Not the kind of nod between a superior and subordinate, but between equals who'd shared something unspoken. That night, the wind returned, howling through the cracks in the tent. I sat by the heater, staring at the medal pinned inside my journal. I'd never worn it again. It didn't feel like something to display. It felt like a reminder to stay human in a profession that tried to sand the humanity out of you. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and patient. I closed my eyes and listened to it settle on the canvas, the same rhythm as breathing. In the silence, I thought about everything that had happened, the storm, the handshake, the meeting in the hangar, and realized it wasn't about recognition. It was about returning to something simple and timeless. Decency. The thing my father had tried to teach me in his own rigid way. The thing that bound every good Marine to something larger than orders. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I wrote in my journal not as an officer, but as a person trying to stay worthy of that word. The mail truck came through a week later, kicking up mud and half-melted snow as it rolled into camp. It was the kind of morning where the fog refused to lift and every sound felt muffled by the cold. Marines gathered like kids around a Christmas tree as the clerk handed out envelopes. I wasn't expecting anything, but there it was, an envelope with my father's slanted handwriting stamped from Beaufort, South Carolina. I stood there for a long time before opening it. Dad wasn't one for words, and letters from him usually contained a few lines about the weather, a story about fixing his old Ford, and maybe a note about keeping your chin up. This one was different. Morgan, got your letter. Read it twice. Didn't think I'd ever see the day you'd question orders and still make me proud for it. When I was your age, I followed every rule in the book. Lost good men doing it. I thought discipline was the only thing that kept us alive. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was decency, same as you found out there in the cold. I used to tell you heart gets you hurt. Truth is, heart's what got me through 30 years of the Corps. It just took me a lifetime to admit it. You did right, kid. Dad. I read it 3 times. The words blurred a little around the edges. Then I folded the letter neatly and slipped it inside my journal right next to the medal and the chocolate wrapper. That night, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. The moon hung over the camp like a watchful eye. I stood outside, letting the air bite my skin, and thought about my father sitting in his recliner back home, probably watching the History Channel with a cold beer. We hadn't spoken properly in years, 2 Marines too stubborn to find middle ground. But now, across an ocean and a lifetime of silence, it felt like we'd finally saluted each other from a distance. The following morning, the general found me by the fuel depot. "Morning, Captain," he said. "Morning, sir." He looked at me for a second, then said, "You heard from home?" I blinked. "Yes, sir. How'd you—" He smiled. "When Marines get mail, their faces change. Doesn't take a psychologist." I laughed softly. "My father. He's proud, I think." "That's new." "Good. That's rare, too." He paused. "You should hold on to that. The pride of a parent means more than 1,000 salutes." I nodded. "Yes, sir." He shifted his gaze toward the convoy line forming at the gate. "You know, Hayes, most people think command is about control. It's not. It's about stewardship. You reminded me of that." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Just keep leading the way you do. Quietly." He walked off, his son trailing behind him, carrying a small NATO flag in his hand. That afternoon, I had a break between briefings. I took a walk outside the wire along the same route our convoy had once taken. The road was quieter now, the snow melted into thin streams that trickled down into the fields. I found the broken fence line where I'd stopped that day. The footprints were gone, but the place still felt alive. I knelt, brushed the dirt, and whispered, "You're safe now." A gust of wind moved through the trees, cold but gentle. I stood for a moment longer before heading back to base. Later that week, our rotation was set to end. We'd be returning stateside in a month. I packed my few things, photos, journal letters, and looked at the medal again. I thought about mailing it home to Dad, but something told me to keep it. It wasn't really a decoration. It was a reminder of who I wanted to keep being. That evening, Jenkins stopped by my tent. "Heard you're heading back soon," he said. "Yeah, looks like it." He grinned. "You gonna miss all this snow? About as much as I miss field rations?" He laughed. "You know, Captain, I still tell new guys about that story, the one with the lady and her kid." I raised an eyebrow. "You do?" "Yeah. Teaches 'em that orders are important, but so's your gut. Figure that's a lesson worth keeping alive." I smiled. "You're turning into a philosopher, Jenkins." "Don't tell the others. Ruin my reputation." We shared a laugh that lingered longer than usual, like both of us knew we were nearing the end of something we'd never forget. That night before lights out, I opened my journal one last time. I slid Dad's letter beside the chocolate wrapper and the medal. 3 pieces of metal paper and foil, but somehow they carried the weight of everything I'd learned. I wrote one final line underneath them. "Honor isn't what people give you. It's what you keep alive when no one's looking." Then I closed the journal and let the silence settle around me. The cold was still there, but it no longer felt cruel. It just felt honest. The day we flew home, the sky over Poland was the same pale gray as when I'd arrived months earlier. The convoy yard buzzed with the rhythm of goodbye boots, stomping trucks, idling men shouting over engines. Every Marine has that moment when deployment ends, when the noise of duty quiets just long enough for memory to catch up. For me, it wasn't pride I felt. It was gratitude. I watched the NATO flags flutter one last time and thought of the woman and her boy. They were safe somewhere, maybe home again, maybe building a new life. The image of their faces had softened into something less haunting, more like a reminder small kindnesses ripple farther than orders ever reach. The flight back to the States was long and sleepless. The cabin smelled of canvas and cold metal, but the mood was light. Jenkins sat beside me, headphones in, tapping his boot to a country song leaking faintly from the earpieces. Every so often he'd glance over and grin as if to say, "We made it." We landed in Quantico before dawn. The tarmac shimmered under floodlights, and I felt that odd, disorienting warmth of being home, like stepping into an old photograph that no longer fit quite right. The debriefs, the medical checks, the paperwork, it all blurred together. By afternoon, I found myself standing outside the administrative building with my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, staring at the U.S. flag. The air smelled of pine instead of diesel. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that. A staff sergeant handed me a sealed envelope. "Captain Hayes from headquarters. Congrats, ma'am." Inside was an invitation, a small recognition ceremony in D.C. for humanitarian service during NATO operations. No red carpets, no television cameras, just quiet acknowledgement. I almost didn't go. But something in me wanted to close the circle properly. 2 weeks later, I stood in a modest hall inside the Pentagon. The room was filled with familiar uniforms and faces I didn't know. On the wall hung the Marine Corps motto in bold letters, "Honor, Courage, Commitment." 3 words I'd recited 1,000 times but only truly understood now. Major General Whitman stepped up to the podium. His voice carried easily but warmly. "We're here today to recognize an officer who reminded us that sometimes leadership isn't about orders, it's about choosing humanity when no one is watching." He motioned for me to stand beside him. I did, straight-backed, trying not to show how fast my heart was beating. He looked out at the small audience, then back at me. Captain Morgan Hayes did what Marines have done for generations. She saw someone in need and acted. No hesitation, no calculation, no reward in mind. Just duty shaped by compassion. He pinned a new ribbon on my uniform, simple, silver-edged. Then he shook my hand and said, "For reminding us what honor looks like when it's quiet." The applause was soft, restrained, the kind that feels more like respect than noise. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Whitman's wife and son approached. The boy had grown taller, his English smoother. He handed me a small drawing, a stick figure Marine standing beside a little boy under falling snow. At the top, in shaky letters, it said, "Thank you, hero." I crouched to meet his eyes. "You're the hero, kid. You survived." He smiled shyly, then saluted. I returned it crisp and proud. Later, standing by the windows overlooking the Potomac, Whitman joined me. "You ever think about staying in?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But wherever I go next, I'll remember this. All of it." He nodded. "Good, then I know we'll be in safe hands." We shook hands one final time. There were no speeches left to make. That night, back in my small apartment in Virginia, I unpacked my things. The medal went into a drawer, the letter from Dad beside it, and the crinkled chocolate wrapper tucked safely inside my journal. I lit a single candle on the table, a habit I'd picked up overseas, and sat quietly listening to the hum of home. I thought about all the stories older Marines used to tell about courage and battle sacrifice loss. Mine was smaller, quieter, but no less true. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in on a cold day, shakes your hand, and disappears again. Before bed, I wrote one last entry in my journal. If you ever doubt what difference one act of kindness makes, remember this. Someone you'll never meet might still be alive because of it, and that's enough to make a lifetime meaningful. I closed the book, set it on the nightstand, and let the quiet fill the room. Then softly, for whoever might listen, I spoke the same words I'd want my father or any Marine or any human being to hear. Be kind when no one's watching. Lead with your heart even when the world tells you not to. That's the only kind of honor that lasts. If this story moved you even a little, share it. Tell someone that decency still matters, that small things still count. Because sometimes that's how the world changes, one quiet act at a time.